Welcome to this session on science advice and publishing. We have three panelists here, and actually, as it so happens, all of us have at some point worked together in the European Commission Scientific Advice Mechanism, so we have a degree of common background, but otherwise are from quite different fields. So we shall start with Susan Owens, Professor of Environment and Policy here at the University of Cambridge, as a fellow of the British Academy. And I think without any further ado, it's better for people to hear from you directly than to hear from me, but I think you're going to say. So, please.
Thank you very much, and it's really good to be here. I can speak for weeks on the subject of science advice because it's both been a subject of my research and I actually do some of it as well. So I'm trying to be very disciplined in making 5 points in 5 minutes. The exam question we were given for this panel was science advice has risen to prominence in recent years, but is still not fully embedded in mainstream academic work. And then we were asked to think about the implications for publishing and the interaction of this issue with publishing. So, first point, there's been a great deal of emphasis, rightly, in recent years on how best to get science advice into policy. I use the term science in its broadest definition, in the Wissenschaft sense. And clearly in relation to that question, publishing has a very important role, has a number of different roles, and many of those have been touched upon in the earlier discussion today, and it's reflected actually on this banner, Research Excellence for Policy, Research into Policy. What I'd like to raise is a rather different way in which the whole issue of science advice interacts with publishing, and that is when we regard science advice and indeed knowledge policy interactions more broadly defined, the bigger context, as Geoffrey was pointing out earlier, that these are subjects of intellectual inquiry in their own right. And that too has led to a change in publications. The second point then is that we're asking not only how science advice can have an impact more effectively on policy, but also what is going on in this rather complicated and intriguing space where science comes into interplay with politics and policy making. Something's going on there. Boris alluded to it earlier in his comments about throwing policymakers out of the room. And how are these processes that go on in that space of interplay between science, policy making and politics, how are they mediated by expert advice? What's the role of expert advice in that space? Some of the questions that have been asked. Who are these advisors? How do they acquire authority and earn trust? How much effect do they have on policy? And perhaps more interestingly, in what circumstances does science advice have effect or not on policy? And then in the larger system, to use Geoffrey's words, what actually is the role of science, knowledge broadly defined, and expertise in the policy processes of modern democracies? I think most of the work on this issue has been about these processes in democracies. So moving on to my third point and linking to the previous session, These are profoundly multi- and interdisciplinary questions, and addressing them has involved many different disciplines and many different literatures, primarily in the social sciences, also to some extent in the humanities. Just to take a few examples. The political and policy sciences have produced numerous theories of policy change, theories of policy evolution and change. Science and technology studies has asked important questions about the role of science in society. And philosophy this is a Horizon 2020 project with which I've recently been involved. It's just drawing to a close. Philosophy has asked important questions about trust and trustworthiness, and all of those are relevant. As I found when I was writing my own book, Knowledge, Policy and Expertise, one of the problems for researchers is that these literatures have often progressed in parallel tracks with very little cross-fertilization of ideas. They haven't talked to each other very much. Nevertheless, over the past 3 or 4 decades, probably, we have developed good theories of knowledge policy interactions. There's now quite a body of theory on that, and about the role of policy advice in those interactions. We've also now, these were unusual 20 or 30 years ago, but there are now an increasing number of in-depth, extended, empirical studies of expertise and advisory practices, sometimes ethnographic, often, through observing these processes in depth and detail over time. The one result is a blossoming of publications on these issues. I haven't done the count, but I think if you try to plot the number of papers and indeed books on the subject of knowledge policy interactions and the role of policy advice, scientific advice and other forms of advice, then you would find probably a very sharp increase over the last 2 or 3 decades. And I should say, actually, these are both in the specialist disciplinary journals, but also in interdisciplinary journals. And, for example, there are relatively new journals specifically dedicated to this field. Science and Public Policy would be an interesting example. And I would observe that the journals of the academies ought to be ideal places for publication of this sort of work. The result of all of this, a lot of research, theorizing, informed sometimes by in-depth empirical work on what is going on in this space between science and policy. The result is that we now have a much better understanding of knowledge policy interactions. We have tried to identify the attributes of good advice, quote unquote, and we know more about the circumstances of influence. When does advice come to have effect? One answer, there's lots to say about that. One is when the political environment is fertile for that advice. If advice falls on politically stony ground, it's rather unlikely to be taken up. So we know much more now about these processes. The puzzle, in a way, and I leave you with this question, is why are highly simplified, one could even say simplistic, models of the science advisory process still so tenacious? Why is there still, in much public and political discourse, a sense that science feeds into policy in a relatively straightforward and uncomplicated way? And these models are very tenacious. So I think without nuance, I might leave you with the question, why is the evidence about evidence-based policy not taken more into account in the design and practice of policy advisory institutions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. We'll come back to several of these points in the discussion. But now I want to move on to our next speaker, Professor Dykstra, who is Professor of Empirical Sociology at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. She is a member of the Academia Europaea and a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Sciences, and importantly, a former chief scientific advisor to the European Commission. So without any further ado, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Owen. I'm delighted to be here, and it's an honor to be here. And I've enjoyed all the discussion so far, and hopefully Susan and I are giving you even more food for thought and discussion. I want to point out that the kind of science advisory experience that I've had is very specific. One is that it's truly, I'm going to use the word multidisciplinary. We started I was there from the very start, and that was 2015, 7 of us. There was Wolf Hoya, the general, what is the word? Okay, the former president of CERN. There was Elvira Fortunato, a materials scientist. She had developed a paper transistor. To this day, I still don't know what it is, but she's currently Minister of Science and Innovation in Lisbon. There was Julia Slingo, who was then the chief scientific advisor in the UK on environmental issues, but she left quite quickly when Brexit came about. Janusz Wojnicki was nominated by the Young Academy, and he's a microbiologist with a very strong background in computer technology. I know I'm forgetting somebody, but when I started, I was the only social scientist. And I remember Wolf telling me, Pearl, what you do, that's not science, is it? Until I sat down with him and I gave him an example of how we measure loneliness. And he said, oh yeah, you measure too. But what was crucial there, and it came forward in some of the previous talks, is we weren't there for ourselves, we were there for the greater good of showing or demonstrating to the scientific community, but also to the policy community, how policy can benefit from proper scientific evidence. We were requested to address the topic of science advice and the impact of publishing. I'm going to make 3 points. The first one is not controversial at all. But the second and the third are points I'm grappling with myself. Somehow I hate repeating myself. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to take the opportunity to dump on you some issues that I haven't responded to, or at least I haven't solved for myself. And I'd like to do it shortly, so if you have the opportunity to say something. The first is the crucial importance of evidence synthesis. What do we know about a well-defined topic, or a well-defined question, I should say? What do we know? What don't we know? Where is the disagreement? And why is there disagreement? And several people, and Susan knows this field much better than I do, who write about policy science advising, say this is the greatest contribution that we as scientists can provide to the policy community. We can't expect the policy community to go through the ambiguity of science, but let's do it for them. And I'm referring to a 2018 report of the Royal Society, which was also written with the Academy of Medical Sciences. And an evidence synthesis is not the same as writing a review. We all write reviews, and we do this when we prepare grants. You know, A did this, and B did this, and C did this, and along comes my team, we're going to do it much better. It's those reviews are about shoving others off the table. Whereas knowledge or an evidence synthesis is, what's our body of knowledge? How much do we know? How much has it accumulated? And that's a different kind of writing and a different kind of putting together a paper. And the Royal Society has opened its journals and now makes it possible, it accepts papers on that are evidence synthesis. So maybe that's something for the editor of the European Review. That was my first point, not controversial at all. The second is this issue of interdisciplinarity. And the idea here is that science advice should bring together insights, I'm using the word insights here, not evidence, from different sources. And I'm using the word sources. The source might be a discipline, the source might also be practice instead of scientific research. The source might also be indigenous knowledge. And I think we all agree that it's important to bring these sources together to integrate them or synthesize them. But the question is, not only how do we do it, but where do we do it? Because one of the issues I'm grappling with is how do we weigh these different perspectives? And of course, we all know economists will go, okay, let's attach euros to it. How much is a life worth? And how much is the medicine going to cost? And how much is this? And that's one perspective. And an ethicist would say, okay, can we rank or weigh in terms of ethics? An ecologist might do something on hazards and risks, and that would be us scientists digesting the multiple perspectives for the policymaker. That's one model, but the model that's often used in policy circles is let's bring in the experts. We'll have a panel and they're all carefully selected because we now know how easy it is to bring in biases into these panels, and we're going to do it as structured as possible. But even then, does this weighing of views come in? And so on the one hand, I think it's necessary if we want to bring the policy advising forward for the scientists to consider, okay, how am I going to weigh all these sources of knowledge? I'm using the word knowledge. Or when the policy receiver of the advice puts everything together, how to weigh or to say, we went for that perspective or we weighed it in a particular way. That's something that still requires further work. And so how to write it up, that's an issue for all of us, and also where and when to write it up. That was my second point. And the third is the issue of transparency. And here I'm going back to and it was Louise Edwards who pointed me towards the article. It was in the very first issue of the European Review. And it was an article by Petersen, who at the time was the German Minister of Science and Innovation. And he was writing on science for, no, it was science using, it was for policy, using scientists to improve science policy and not policy. But one thing that he did say was very important in his work, and also for the acceptability and the credibility of the science advice, was transparency on who's on these committees. What are the disciplines? Are they always the same people? Or do the memberships change over time? But what we learned, and now I'm talking we is now the 7 of us in Brussels. The situation in which we worked is that we could it was wonderful. We still can rely on SAPEA, Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, who would do the evidence review reports. We have, as 7 of us, we have the evidence review reports. Then there's a wonderful group of people in Brussels who do one of Susan's points. How can the policy land best? What's the timing? What is the policy landscape? How can we find a particular policy framework that we can target our recommendations towards? But in all of what we write, first of all, there's that body of evidence and the policy context, but then we have to arrive at recommendations, and something that we tried to do, but I think we're still very unsuccessful at, is what are the principles we were using? We very often use the social pillar of the Human Rights Declaration of Europe. We tried to be very specific about the uncertainty. We tried to be very specific about the assumptions, but I don't think we said this in words, but I'm not sure we wrote it up as professionally as might have been possible. But the second part is, so there's the recommendations, but then it's on the part of the recipient. We all know that science advice is only one of the inputs that policymakers receive. They have to think of the electorate, they have to think of finances, they have to think of whatever. But we also know what happens is that the science advice is not heeded. And in those circumstances, we argue, and we're talking the 7 of us, that the policy advisor should say, thank you for your advice. We didn't follow it for such and such and such and such reason, which would be helpful to the scientific community, but also clarify the role that science advice plays within the whole policy-making process. So those were my few points, and I hope I didn't go past 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Pearl, for these very interesting remarks. I will say a few words also, and my perspective is partially a bit in line with what you have just heard, but also a little bit different. I represent the science side. I'm also an editor of a journal. So these are my particular perspectives. And if we can get the first point up there, then we have very little time. I just make the point that many of the points I will make have actually been published in a European review last year. So I just refer you also to that in case you have interest. Now, we have heard a bit about the scientific advice mechanism, particularly the European Commission's one. And here in this picture here, you also see Pearl at the first meeting between the chief scientific advisors and FAPEA. We were both there, and this nice occasion. I'm not going to talk in detail about this, but it's clear that that kind of formal scientific advice, obviously it's based to a very large extent on scientific publications, and also that the advice is published, and there are examples of some of the evidence reports that came out of various working groups, including one in which Susan was present. But my point here is that this kind of official, I would call it official science advice, is in reality only a very tiny part of science advice more generally. And that if we think about sort of the major disruptions, if we can put it that way, in our society, they have mostly come about not as a result of governmental policy interventions, but actually have come across from science discoveries that were taken up by clever entrepreneurs. And obviously all of us can immediately think of examples that have so much influenced our daily life in our lifetime. So that's actually in many ways more important than the formal science advice. And one example that I have been involved in from the side of medicine, but that can also be generalized to many other parts, is what we may call a kind of science advice knowledge cycle. And that cycle here in relation to translating medicine has the interesting property that you can start the cycle anywhere actually. But the important point is that it is a cycle that goes on from discovery to applied science to more clinical science in this example, to generating useful knowledge that then obviously has to be published, and again published in a whole range of different types of outlets, which then actually leads to a product or new procedures, which then again opens up new possibilities, and then the cycle can continue. So a lot of science advice actually happens in that kind of informal environment, and nevertheless has huge implications for society. So the kind of questions or conclusions that I would end up with are here on the screen. So first of all, since we are talking about scientific publications, so I'll just make the obvious point that scientific publications actually underpin all real science advice, whether it is formal or not. And then that's very important also, that in order for this to happen, the scientific publications need obviously to be real, and they need to be of good quality. But what is particularly important perhaps is that there needs to be a considerable degree of clarity. And then we can ask the question, is everything okay in the scientific publication world? And the answer clearly is no, it is not. And I just mentioned sort of two examples there highlighted in red. A quite important comment from Paul Nurse, published in Nature 2 years ago. We are in the biological sciences drowning in data and starving for knowledge. I think that's quite important. And I have taken up that scene in an editorial in Function, which actually is one of the most downloaded editorials that I've ever written. Namely, are scientists sufficiently ambitious? And in that sense, I don't mean ambitious in terms of becoming rich or famous, but whether scientists actually are approaching real problems that are of real importance. And then again, the point I already made, that most scientific advice actually occurs informally, but has enormous effects. And then a quite important point about inequality in scientific publications, which is enormous. And I just point out that this is a very serious problem. It's clear that those countries that have a strong science base, well-funded science base, they will inevitably dominate scientific advice, whether formally or informally. And they will therefore also basically determine the nature of our future. And there the inequalities are colossal. You know, it's only a tiny part of the world actually that fully participates in the scientific endeavor. And I will stop there, and we can open up for discussion. So please come with your questions or comments. It doesn't have to be questions, actually, but there will probably be quite a few comments, I guess, here. Okay, let's start down there.
Yeah, so I think when you talk about scientific advice, you're talking essentially about lobbying. And it's lobbying for trying to get some good evidence-based reasoning into policy and legislation. And we're advising people on the political scene. We're fighting against those who are lobbying for completely different things, not necessarily evidence-based. And I think if we don't put that into the context, we will not achieve our goals, because we're just thinking, because we're scientists, we're so great, people will listen to us, but we're not addressing all the undercurrents we're really fighting against.
Well, maybe April will start out.
When you used the word, you said the word lobbying, I was shaking my head. No, let me continue. What's crucial is our credibility. And if we were lobbyists And there are a lot of lobbyists, and I can only speak about Brussels, there are a lot of lobbyists. We even spoke to industry. You wouldn't believe the journalists that criticized us for it. You're listening to industry, and we said, okay, yes, we listen, because we have to know what's happening there. But can you prove that whatever point you made or was made by this individual in such and such a meeting influenced what we said? What we do is not lobbying. We say this is the state of the art, which points in such and such a direction. And what we also did is we elaborated the code on conflict of interest, and what we included in it was our personal interest. We all have a scientific field. I can tell you it will be about something about women's position in this world, and I'm not going to hide. But if I say something based on evidence, if I point to what is known about Gallagher, for example, and I suggest this, am I lobbying, or am I working for a better world on the basis of pretty darn solid evidence? So one is, we are not lobbyists. We really try to use the voice of science and take the best of science. And we're using, and it's also a recognition on the part of, in this case, the European Commission, of the importance of science in informing society.
Susan, would you like to say something? It's an important question.
A questioner wants to come back
And this
and then
man
I'll come
comes
in.
just.
Is that related to this point?
It is.
And then
Okay,
I'll
then
come
go
in.
ahead and then we will continue.
I think what Pearl presented is very realistic at the level of the European Commission in its external interface to the scientific community. However, there is one part of scientific advising that seems to be forgotten in your presentation. A minister of universities in a country, say like France, has a scientific advisor. I did that job for 2.5 years full time, 8 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock at night. Okay, and members of the European Commission, some of them have scientific advisors in their teams. The scientific advisors in the teams may be kind of more general purpose. For instance, it may be someone with a broad engineering background that advises on just about everything, including things outside of engineering. So there isn't a specialty kind of thing happening, but all of these people have scientific advisors. And the job of the scientific advisor to the politician, that's a very important interface that you have to look at, is to synthesize everything that comes in from the committees at CNRS or other organizations to the lobbying done by different disciplines, which also happens, and very actively, to the lobbying by industry of their particular interests and priorities. So all of this is looked at, and there is a human being, perhaps someday in an AI program, who knows, but I think it's still a human being who sits there and spends practically 24 hours a day thinking about this, and then providing short decisions that a minister can digest and execute, okay? Or a member of the European Council execute and so on. So I think this aspect of scientific advising is something that many people neglect because they think everything happens in committees, but no, the actions happen at the level of these individuals who write short notes at the end. It's going to be half a page saying this problem, this budget, we are going to assign in this way because I think, advisor, that this is the best and I have consulted blah, 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 blah. This is just half a page. That translates into decisions. So I just hope that you realize that there is this kind of work going on and that the contact with these people is of extreme importance. When I was working, the research minister was Curien, whom you all know because he's a founder of Academia Europaea. The universities minister was Roger Schwarzenberg, and the decisions were taken jointly between the cabinets, the advisors of these two ministers, on the allocation, on the budget allocations to priority areas. I just wanted to mention this because this is a very important aspect, I think, of the scientific advising and the interaction with the scientific community that many academics just are not aware of.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Let me work backwards. So I completely agree with your comment that there are different kinds of scientific advice and different modes through which it takes place. So we do have committees and commissions and all sorts of bodies, sometimes more numerous than can be accounted for. Individuals, obviously, within and outside government give scientific advice, and sometimes the advice takes place over a quick phone call or a Zoom call, I suppose I should say, now that we have to look at each other as well as hear each other. So yes, I think there are, and any research on advisory practices has to look across the range of those. With two colleagues in Cambridge, I was involved in doing some work and writing a paper on the role of chief scientific advisors in UK government. The paper has ended up being called the elevator pitch because of what one of them said in an interview, and he said that sometimes he had to lurk at the bottom waiting for the lift in order to catch the minister at a good moment to deliver as much advice as he could get over in the time the lift went up to the third floor or whatever it was. So I completely agree. There are many different kinds of advice. On the question of whether advisors are lobbyists in favour of evidence-based policy, just a few comments on that. So first of all, I use the term evidence-based policy, but with a kind of warning that it was non-nuanced. As far as I'm aware, there is no policy in any democracy that is purely evidence-based. Policy is a product of many different forces, and knowledge is one of them. Knowledge is hugely important. Evidence is important, and I would add, especially in the longer term. When you look back, policies have been transformed beyond recognition. In my field, environmental governance, since the 1960s, policies have been transformed beyond recognition, and that is something to do with a huge expansion in knowledge about the environment and human-environment relations. But at any one moment, many of us have felt intensely frustrated that that knowledge isn't being taken into account. So I think the term evidence-based policy itself merits deep scrutiny and a better understanding of policy processes. I know you used it in a shorthand, as I did. I'll just make one comment. I have written about and spent 10 years as a member of the former UK Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, which advised governments for 41 years across many different political persuasions, had very extensive influence. And it's just sort of worth mentioning that the fastest ever time between the Commission report being published and ministers accepting a rather radical recommendation was 35 minutes. I mean, it wasn't formally accepted in 35 minutes, but a minister was running along a corridor shouting, "We've got it, we've got it." So I think that was a recommendation that legitimised a government U-turn. So it was very welcome. The longest time where something really changed quite dramatically with tracing back to a report from the Royal Commission was 15 years, which is quite a long time to wait. And I'll finish with one observation, and that's that we have to make a distinction between science advice on slow burn, the sort of stuff that goes on all the time, and science advice in emergencies, which is something that we've experienced recently. And it may be qualitatively different. And I think, there perhaps needs to be more work on that distinction. Thanks, Celia.
Yeah, like Pearl, I was also shocked by the lobbying. word. And let me just say that, I mean, to me, a lobbyist is somebody who advises something that would be in his or her personal interest. And I agree with Pearl. I don't think that the scientific advice mechanism that I have been involved in involved lobbying in that sense at all. But the other point, I would say we have, maybe that's a bit controversial, but I think we have a tendency to overestimate the importance of certain individuals, and that certainly is in the political domain. So those of us who have worked in scientific advice mechanism tend to overestimate the importance of a science minister or whatever. I have a very Tolstoyan view. I think that the history of sort of great people is basically bogus, and that there are certain developments that happen in a much more generalized way that is not entirely transparent, and that the influence of certain individuals who seem powerful at a particular time is actually in the great measure of things not that fantastic. Of course, this is a session about scientific advice and publication, and I would like to point out that the advice that is published does not merely have the importance of directly going to those people who are in charge of policy at this point in time. The publications have a long life, as Susan has pointed out, and by themselves can actually influence events in a big way. If we think about climate change, then publications in that area went on for years and years and years without policymakers taking any interest in it whatsoever. What created the background that finally made it possible for policymakers to make. So we should not forget about that. We are basically out of time, I'm afraid, but since Stephen goes a bit on our time, sorry to mention that, we may have time for one or two very quick questions.
It strikes me that there are 2 points of leverage for policy, and interesting to see what you think about it. The relative importance. One of them is with policymakers themselves attempting to provide them with the evidence to permit them to make a better policy. The other one, of course, is with the opinions of those people that will ultimately determine whether or not a policy can be implemented. That is, us fellow citizens. Where's the biggest deficit? Is it we're not good enough with the policymakers, because we're not good enough with our fellow citizens?
Jeffrey, to be honest, I don't fully understand your question. I'm going to try, and then you can say yes or no. One is, how are we as a collection of scientists vis-a-vis policymakers? Or how are we as a collection of scientists vis-a-vis citizens? Is that your question? Okay. I think, to be honest, that second question is one that's newer in our minds and in our heads, and also I think we have to admit that we scientists, and I take Susan's broad definition, we're also shoved by institutional infrastructural pressures. And I think the infrastructural pressure to make an impact, in the sense of, it used to be go out and make money, and then it was okay, go out and make a difference in policy. And now the most recent pressure is, hey,
Please, I'll try and be brief.
can you engage with citizens, hear what they have to say, hear whether what you're doing is in their interest? I think that's where much more work has to be done. I think that that's not as mature as the science or the policy making nexus is.
Okay, quick from Susan.
Thanks, that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I would wholly separate the two in the way that you have. because, I mean, some of the issues coming out of the so-called Horizon 2020 Peritia project on policy, expertise and trust would look at the way in which citizens do or don't trust those giving advice, but also citizens may form a view about how the advice is used. So that there are two dimensions to that. I think you're right to raise questions about citizens and public perspectives. I've just in last year finished leading on a study for DEFRA of public engagement, and some of that is public engagement in quite major scientific and techno-scientific questions. And there's an awful lot to be said about all of that, so I won't say any of it. Just make one more comment. Sometimes the most important thing advisors do is reframe the question. And some of the most, in the case of the Royal Commission, which you were also a member of, Jeffrey, some of the longest lasting influence came when that commission said to government, you're not asking the right question. So go back and rethink it. And those sorts of reframings lead to what Peter Hall, a political scientist, calls third order policy change, when the whole structure and language of policy changes. And that's some of the most important, certainly in the environmental field.
Okay, I think we are out of time, and thank you to Pearl and thank you, Susan, for your very important contribution. And we even had a bit of controversy here, which is not a bad thing. So time for a tea or a coffee break. Thank you very much.